So knowing how to listen to events on the host element and knowing about host binding and host listener is important as an Angular developer. There is one other last host element related feature you should know about though. Because sometimes in certain situations you might need programmatic access to the host element. So you might need to interact with it from inside your TypeScript code. For example, let's say here, when we click on the host element, I want to output some information about it, which obviously is not a real use case, but here in this app, I don't have a real use case because it is a feature you won't need that often, but you should still know about it. So for this demo, let's say we want to log some host element information whenever it is clicked. Now, what you can do to achieve this is you can inject a special value into your component, a value that will be provided by Angular. And you can inject either with the constructor, as you learned it for services, or with help of that inject function, about which you also learned. And I'll use the latter here, but both would work. So for that, I'll add a private property here, which therefore won't be exposed to the template of this component since I don't need access to it there. And I'll name it L, but the name is up to you. And the value of that property should then be the result of calling inject, which must be imported from @Angular core, of course. And to inject, we now have to pass a special class name, the element ref class name, which also must be imported from @Angular core. Element ref is a class defined by Angular, so it's part of the Angular framework, which defines a reference to some element that's rendered to the page. So it's pretty generic because it can refer to any element on the page. But by injecting it into a component like this, Angular will give you access to the host element of that component. So therefore, here we can console log this.l. And with that, if you save it and you reload, if you click on that app control element, you get clicked, of course, but you also get that injected element ref object. And that is then an object that has a native element property, and that property then actually holds your host element. So if I expand that, you see that this is in the end what Angular knows about the host element that's rendered to the DOM. And it's essentially a collection of properties that exist for all DOM elements. And you could now extract information from those properties. You could also change them, though you should be careful about that because you typically don't want to start changing what's visible on the page programmatically by using the element ref. Instead, you should change what's visible on the page by changing data and using template features as we always did it throughout this course. But if you need programmatic access to the host element, this is how you can get it, by injecting element ref. Maybe you recall that in the server status component CSS file, there are some CSS selectors which don't select anything. Because I'm looking for a CSS class status or status online or offline, and in that template, those classes don't exist anywhere. Instead, what we have in this template is some conditional check with the @if statement, about which you learned earlier in the course, combined with else if to check for an additional condition, and else to render something that will be rendered if none of these conditions is met. But we don't have those CSS classes here. Now, my idea with those classes is to add them conditionally to an element here in the template. just as we're outputting some elements conditionally. Now, to make that work and to actually see that something's rendered conditionally or some class is added conditionally, we first of all need to tweak that server status component TypeScript code. Because in there I got this current status property, and at the moment it's always set to online. Now, my idea with this component is that it should reflect a changing server status. Now, of course, this is just a dummy application here, so we don't actually grab any real server status, but I at least want to change the current server status every couple of seconds, let's say. I want to randomly change it from online to offline or to unknown. These are the three different status values I want to support. Therefore, what I'll do here is I'll bring back a wrapping div, because it's on that div where I want to add some class conditionally. And we can then add a class conditionally or set the class value dynamically with help of Angular's class binding, which looks like this. You can bind the class property on a div dynamically by using this property binding syntax, but under the hood, Angular then actually detects that it's the class you're binding, and it then extends the default property binding syntax for this class property, you could say. For example, if you would want to set the status class conditionally, you could do it like this. You could set class.status and then, for example, check if current status equals offline, like this. Now the status class would only be applied to that div if this condition is met. And that is a syntax you saw earlier in the course already, that you can add or remove classes dynamically with help of this syntax. So here in this case, where server status is online, this check here will actually produce false, and the status class will not be added to this div. As a result, if you save that and you reload, and you then inspect that server status component, you'll see that div in there, this div here, inside of the app server status component, but there is no class on it. Now, if I change my check to check for online, and we'll soon make sure that this actually changes dynamically. For the moment, I'll leave it hard-coded. But if I check for online and save this, you'll see that this class is added. So that's how you can add or set classes dynamically with help of Angular's class binding feature. But that is a syntax you already knew. Now we'll dig a bit deeper and see how else you could use this feature in ways you didn't know about yet. So how else can you bind and set classes dynamically? Well, besides using this syntax, which allows you to add a single class dynamically, you can also use a different syntax that allows you to dynamically control multiple classes simultaneously. For that, you have to remove this .status here and instead set class to an object. And this object can now contain multiple key value pairs where every key represents one CSS class you want to set dynamically, and the value should yield true or false depending on whether that class should be added or not. So for example, we could say that the status class should always be added. So we could simply set this to true. But then as an additional key value pair, we might want to conditionally add the status online class. And for that, we have to add status-online as a property and then define the condition that determines whether this is added or not. So in my case here, that current status must be equal to online for this class to be applied. Now, if you were to save it like this, you'd get an error though, because this is actually an invalid property name. In JavaScript and TypeScript, you can't add properties that include dashes or whitespace like this to an object. Even though I'm not seeing an error here in my IDE, this is not something you can do. Instead, if you have properties that must contain a dash, like here, where my class I'm targeting has a dash, in such situations, you have to convert these properties to strings by wrapping them with quotes. This is allowed by both JavaScript and TypeScript, and therefore now this will be added as a class dynamically to this div if this condition is met. And we can now also add status-offline if current status is equal to offline, or add status-unknown as a class to this div if current status is equal to unknown. Well, and with that, if you save that, the error goes away, and this now looks differently because now we got this blinking purple text here. And we have that because we're now adding those classes dynamically. Though, of course, at the moment it's not too dynamic because this is hard-coded. Of course, I can change it here, and if I do and I save that, I see the different styles in action, but it never changes once the application is running. But we'll take care of that soon.